What's up, Daddy-O?
Hey there, groovy bird. Blast your peepers down below. Say hi to that cool cat that is the B-Movie Poop Shoot. Cool, man. That bird over there who's just the ginchiest, that's Nurse Disembody. What's up, groovy chick?
I'm crazy cool over here and ready to get this swingin' hootenanny going, Dad. Let's get on it.
You got it, Angel, and no need to go ape. Hello, Animaniacs. If you can't tell, we've got ourselves a flick about Beatniks on this week's episode of B-Movie Enema. Sort of. What we have here is the 1959 movie called Beatniks, directed by voice actor Paul Frees.
I'm really excited to learn more about how the Beatniks really lived in the 50s and get a real, in-depth, inside look at what their personalities and culture was all about.
Yeah, I think we're really going to need to examine that title versus reality throughout this episode. But let's talk about our director, Solomon Hirsch Frees, better known as Paul Frees. He was born in 1920 in Chicago, Illinois. He got his start in showbiz in the 1930s under the stage name Buddy Green. That start was in vaudeville as an impressionist. Then, in 1942, he transitioned to radio to start a 40-year career. And this pretty much sets Frees up for what he was best known as, a voice actor. Most of his work is uncredited, which was sadly the norm for voice actors back then. But he did a lot of dubbing work. He voiced Toshiro Mifune's performance as Admiral Yamamoto in Midway. He actually did pretty much the entirety of the falsetto lines for Tony Curtis when Curtis was dressed as a woman in Some Like It Hot. He also filled in to dub some of Humphrey Bogart's final lines in The Harder They Fall when the actor was suffering from esophageal cancer and struggled to speak. As an actor, he had some good roles. He was Dr. Voorhees in The Thing from Another World.
How cool was it that they had a hockey mask-wearing monster fight the Fantastic Four's Ben Grimm? It was such a special occasion to cross over those two things. They made Jason a doctor. No?
No.
Bummer.
Yeah, however, I do kind of want to see that now. But anyway, Freese's work in live-action films included being a horse in Mary Poppins, a cat in Gay Paris, and aliens in Earth versus the Flying Saucers. But narrating films was a big job for Frees. He narrated The Shaggy Dog, Snow White and the Three Stooges, The Disorderly Orderly, The Carpetbaggers, The Manchurian Candidate, and The St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Most of that work went uncredited as well. However, he did get credited as narrator in the final moments of our world's existence at the very end of 1970's Beneath the Planet of the Apes. And the lines were, "In one of the countless billions of galaxies in the universe lies a medium-sized star, and one of its satellites, a green and insignificant planet, is now dead." In 1984, Frees voiced the antagonist to Kit, named Carr, in a couple of episodes of 1982's Knight Rider.
I'm kind of glad that we're still being haunted by the specter of David Hasselhoff, even as we talk about a movie that's sort of supposed to be about beatniks.
Hey man, you can never hassle the Hoff, but Paul Frees' main work was in animation though. He did a lot of work on Tom and Jerry shorts, as well as shorts made by Tex Avery. By the end of the 1950s, he was working quite heavily for Walt Disney. Interestingly, the only movie of Disney's that he had a voice part in was 101 Dalmatians. His greatest work with Disney would be the voice of Ludwig von Drake, the duck professor who hosted the Walt Disney's Wonderful World of Color anthology series on TV, as well as providing voices for some of Disney theme park rides and attractions. Later in the 60s, he was Boris Badenov on The Rocky and Bullwinkle Show. He did lots of stuff for Rankin Bass, including their specials for Frosty the Snowman and Santa Claus is Coming to Town. In 1965, he voiced both John and Ringo on the short-lived Beatles cartoon series. He also did advertising mascot voices for the ghostly Booberry, the Pillsbury Doughboy, and took over the role of Toucan Sam from Mel Blanc. And, wouldn't you know it, nurse, he voiced the Thing on the 1960s Fantastic Four cartoon series.
Ha! I knew the Thing was around here somewhere.
Hey, you were right. Freeze did a ton of voice work. His voice can be heard in so many places. He often got called upon whenever someone needed an Orson Welles sound-alike. He was picked specifically to do that style of voice for his work in 1953's War of the Worlds. This led to producer George Powell and Freeze becoming friends and frequent collaborators, so much so that Freeze narrated an 1985 documentary about Powell. Sadly, Freeze's health would deteriorate in the 80s. He suffered from diabetes, arthritis, and even lost his sight before he passed away in 1986. He would tell friends that he was in almost constant pain. His passing would be considered a suicide, as it was clear he overdosed on pain medication. His protege, Corey Burton, who I know best as several voices for characters across multiple Transformers series, would pick up the baton and often do very similar voices to what Freeze would be known for.
Kind of sad he was in so much pain at the end.
Now, as for how a voice actor would get chosen to be director of an exploitation film in the vein of Reefer Madness, I don't really know. The Beatniks is the only film Freeze ever directed. Freeze co-wrote this movie with Arthur Julian. Julian would be mostly known as a writer and producer doing a lot of work on TV. In fact, as a writer, he worked heavily on shows like F Troop, The Carol Burnett Show, Hogan's Heroes, and Maude. As a producer, he produced 96 episodes of Gimme a Break and 65 episodes of Amen. But the weirdest thing, nurse?
What's that?
He also wrote the 1970 live-action Disney comedy The Boatniks.
Wow, so he got the inside scoop on the lives of both Beatniks and Boatniks?
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and argue right now that one of those he had absolutely no scoop on, inside or out. One of the producers of this movie, Ron W. Miller, is absolutely no slouch. He had a very brief career in the NFL with the Los Angeles Rams after playing football at USC. Now, the reason why he didn't last long in the NFL was because his father-in-law was Walt Disney. Famously, it's said that Walt told Ron that he didn't want to ultimately become the father to Ron's children if he died playing football, so he gave him a job. This would eventually lead to Miller becoming CEO and president of Walt Disney Studios in the early 80s. Now, unfortunately, while he did oversee the productions of two great Disney films, The Fox and the Hound and Tron, during his tenure, this was not a particularly great time for the studio. He would be succeeded by Michael Eisner in the role of CEO, and by Frank Wells as president, which set the stage for the studio to bounce back in such a way that would launch Disney into the tippy top of Hollywood in terms of power, just within about a decade after those two took over.
What a strange group of cubes that made this flick, man.
But the only thing we need to figure out, my sister, is if this movie is going to be Squaresville or a Stone Cold Gas. Not that kind of gas, poop shoot. But I do think it's time that we get into it. What do you say, Nurse D, baby?
Cool, Daddy-O. You know what is kind of awkward?
Yeah, I know most people think I definitely have a pretty good handle on understanding what's awkward and what's not, Nurse, but what might you be referring to?
Going to a restaurant, playing the jukebox, and then dancing awkwardly in a portion of the joint that I don't think is really a dance floor.
Yeah, that is kind of weird, right? Imagine walking in and seeing people just dancing over there where they should be eating hamburgers.
Oh, wait. How about if the guy starts singing to the girl? Like, that's some cringe, man. Did he make up those lyrics on the spot? Did that particular jukebox just happen to have an instrumental version of that specific song that he just happened to know the lyrics to?
Well, at least they do like jazz hands at the end.
Yeah, and I thought Beatniks did snaps. I'm starting to think these characters aren't really Beatniks.
No, how could that possibly be? I mean, this movie is called The Beatniks. So, the movie was released in 1959, likely kind of nebulously, as it was probably trickled out to drive-ins in a prolonged release region by region. It was filmed in 1958 under the original title of Sideburns and Sympathy.
What a weird title.
Yeah, but I can kind of see it splashed across the screen or on a poster. But it is kind of a weird title, isn't it? I mean, it doesn't really sound like a 1950s title, but it does go along with the first song we hear Eddie Crane sing at that diner, as that is a song about sideburns not needing sympathy. Now, you might be asking,
are these people actually Beatniks?
Who is writing these songs for Eddie Crane?
Sure.
The songs for this movie were written by Eddie Brandt and Paul Frees. Now, Brandt is kind of an interesting character. He also was born in Chicago in 1920. Now, I don't know if he was friends with Frees or what. After all, Chicago is a pretty big place, and a lot of people were born in Chicago in 1920. But I would have to think this is a little more than just a coincidence that these two guys from Chicago of the same age would be working together on this movie. But I'll put away my tinfoil hat for now. What makes Brandt more interesting than being from the same city as Paul Frees is, was that he was an avid lover of movies, and perhaps even more so, memorabilia. He got a job as a teenager at a movie theater as an usher. This gave him a way to start collecting memorabilia. Some guy bought some of the posters he had collected to decorate a new bar that the guy was setting up. So Brandt discovered that there certainly was a market for such things. And in the late 60s, he opened a memorabilia and thrift store in North Hollywood. That same store, named Eddie Brandt's Saturday Matinee, about a decade later, became the very first place to rent videos in Los Angeles. By June 2011, it became the largest video store in the United States with an inventory of 80,000 video cassettes and 20,000 DVDs. But by the time it hit those numbers, Eddie had passed away from colon cancer, and the business had been long managed and run by his wife Claire and one of their sons. But for people who were big on film memorabilia, it was deemed a mecca. Movie historian and TV film host Ben Mankiewicz did a segment about the store and featured it on Turner Classic Movies. I mean, it's that kind of a big deal.
You worked at a video store and a movie theater at 2 different times in your life. Did you like it?
Oh yeah, my time spent working at the video store was some of my favorite times ever being employed as an adult. And I had some good times working in the projection booth at a movie theater. And I do miss those times, Nurse.
Well, hey, now you get to talk about movies and host them. That's gotta be a fun time, too.
Yeah, if it only paid the bills.
Well, that's a whole heap of fair enough.
Yeah. Anyway, Brandt was a self-taught piano player. He served in the Navy during World War II, and while stationed in San Francisco, he formed a band. Later, he composed and produced music with the likes of Spike Jones and Eddie Cantor. By the 50s, he had moved to Hollywood and served as a band leader for a local TV station, KLAC Channel 13. That connection with Spike Jones led to him writing for the Spike Jones Show in the 50s. Then, after working on this film, he would go on to do a little bit of voice work and writing for Hanna-Barbera. Now, kind of wild that he did a little bit of music and a little bit of writing for TV, but it would ultimately be his love of memorabilia that would be his lasting legacy. But sadly, this kind of happy tale of Eddie Brandt's Saturday Matinee, a store that embraced a lot of nostalgia and provided a lot of nostalgic memories for those who frequent the store, that was hit with a sort of sad end. With the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic and the necessary attempts to try to quell the spread of the virus, Eddie Brandt's Saturday Matinee was closed. Now, while the store was originally intending on just finding a new location to move to, unfortunately, as weeks turned into months and months into years, the store was unable to find a new home. And in that time, also, Eddie's widow, Claire, passed away, as did one of the key employees of the store that fought hard to keep the place open and operating. And it would seem as though with each passing day, week, month, and year, Eddie Brandt's Saturday Matinee is becoming more of a memory and less likely a returning piece of old Hollywood and home video nostalgia.
How come you always spotlight the sad stuff, Jeff? Paul Frees kills himself to relieve the pain he was suffering from. This beloved piece of Los Angeles history is closed and people closely associated with it are dead. You're bumming me out, man. So, can the lips on this sad business.
All right. Let's see if you can pick up on what I have to say about some of the crazy cool hipsters in this movie, dig?
Now I'm tuned in.
Alright, so our key character here is Eddie Crane, played by Tony Travis. Now, Travis was a New Yorker born in 1926. He had a very brief movie and TV career lasting only about 5 years. However, in most of these roles, he played a singer. And considering he would also get credit on soundtracks, I have to assume his main career was probably as a nightclub or lounge singer. He certainly had the look and the sound of one. And I did find a site called Blue Sounds that had a couple of his albums that you could buy digitally. And interestingly, none of the songs from this movie are on those albums. Maybe not so much interestingly, but maybe fortunately. But Iris, Eddie Squeeze at the beginning of this movie, is played by Karen Cadler. Cadler had a career just a tad longer than Travis. However, just before this movie, she did have the role of Ellen Peters in the Roger Corman classic It Conquered the World. Then in 1962, she starred as Tanya opposite Lon Chaney Jr. Satan in The Devil's Messenger. Joyce Terry plays Eddie's new love interest, Helen Tracy, and I like how close those two names are. I could very easily say that Helen Terry played Joyce Tracy or Tracy Terry played Helen Joyce. Anyway, Joyce Terry was at the end of her career with this film. She goes back to the 40s when she voiced Raggedy Ann a couple of times in cartoons. Her other significant role was in The Neanderthal Man. However, in 1955, she had a small role in The Naked Street. That film had some pretty big names in the cast, like Farley Granger, Anthony Quinn, Anne Bancroft, and Peter Graves. But in 1959, she did The Beatniks and a short on TV, and she was done. However, she was married to Paul Frees for some years, starting in 1951, and very likely at least remained married to him into the early 60s before divorcing. But she and Frees ended up having a couple of kids together. The old man who is present to discover Eddie Crane is Harry Bayliss, played by Charles Delaney. This was his final role. He racked up pretty much right around 100 roles in his career that dated back to the early 20s in the silent era. I actually quite like him in this movie. He's kind of that nice old father figure to our main protagonist. I like him.
He's alright.
There's just no pleasing you sometimes.
Meh.
Okay, well, anyway, the guys who actually have the most interesting careers in the film are the three guys that run with Eddie and Iris. We start with Bob Wells playing Chuck. Now, Bob Wells is a Primetime Emmy Award winner. He was nominated 3 times over for the 1974 variety special Shirley MacLaine, If They Could See Me Now. He won for writing while being nominated for producing the special itself. Over the course of about 55 years, he only had about 14 roles. But if you are from the Cleveland area, you know him as something entirely different. From 1965 to 1971, he was Houlihan the Weatherman on WJW Channel 8. But he was also teamed with long-time horror host of the Cleveland area, Big Chuck Shadowski, for the Houlihan and Big Chuck Show. Wells also played supporting bits on another Northern Ohio staple, Shock Theater, with Ghilardi. Now, these are big-time names in the movie hosting biz, people. Wells eventually left the horror hosting behind and moved to Florida to go into Christian broadcasting as he and his wife became born-again Christians. That left Big Chuck to team with Lil John Rinaldi for the Big Chuck and Lil John show that ran until 2007. Big Chuck and Lil John, for several years following the end of their broadcast days, would continue to do appearances, sometimes with Houlihan, at conventions, particularly Ghilardi Fest, which was Northern Ohio's big classic monster movie convention that ended its run in 2019. Next, we have Sam Edwards, who plays Red. Edwards was already a 20-plus year veteran by this point. He had mostly uncredited and bit parts. Probably best known performance of his was voicing the adult Thumper in 1942's Bambi. Edwards was also closely tied to Disney, having appeared in The Biscuit Eater and Escape to Witch Mountain, as well as a Disney-produced TV movie later in his career. By far, the most interesting character in this movie is Moon, and he's played by Peter Breck. Breck ended up with about a 50-year career that started a few years before the Beatniks and ended with 2004's Jiminy Glick in La La Wood. He appeared on a ton of TV shows. Another popular movie he appeared in was The Crawling Hand in 1963, and in that, he played Steve Carran, the lead of the film itself. And around the same time of this film's release, he was at the start of a 44-episode run on Black Saddle. And but perhaps probably his most recognizable role was from 1965 to 1969 as Nick Barkley in The Big Valley. But in this, oh boy, Moon is one of those characters that you get stuck with and they will ruin your life. He's dangerous, he's crazy.
He makes my skin crawl.
And so that leads to the next question.
Are these characters actually Beatniks?
Why would somebody like Eddie Crane hang out with somebody like Moon? I mean, Eddie seems to have have some anti-establishment slant to him, sure, but he seemingly has a conscience, and he actually seems to not entirely want to be a complete and total nut. Okay, sure, he takes part in a robbery, he's kind of a jerk, but he feels like one of those kind of bored kids with like a decent upbringing. Maybe he's a rich kid dickhead. I don't know. Maybe he's just a kid who got bored and listless and didn't know where to go in life, so he fell into a bad crowd.
But are these actually Beatniks, Jeff?
You know, I think we can take on one more subject before we pass judgment. So let's get back into the movie, and we'll come back to talk Beatniks, groovy kids. So let's fall back into this flick, and we'll be back here in 2 shakes of a lamb's tail.
Seriously, Jeff.
So what is a beatnik?
Finally!
The group of people called Beatniks rolled out of a subculture movement that had literary connections to a group called the Beat Generation. The authors who began to popularize the subculture were keen to reject typical narrative concepts. They might write about spiritual quests, as well as explore religions from America and philosophies from Eastern cultures. Characters were very against materialism and, by extension, capitalism. The books often explored various portrayals of the human condition and contained a lot of pretty explicit sex, also usage of psychedelics and what have you, which were all major parts of the writers themselves. Several members of the group had gay or pansexual appetites. They were known to partake in a lot of drugs and alcohol, lived life with few possessions, and often talked about things in existential sorts of ways. The key writers of the Beat Generation met in 1944 in and around Columbia University. These authors were Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, William S. Burroughs, Lucian Carr, and Herbert Huncke. Now, Huncke was the kind of freeloading, free spirit. Burroughs was the tortured one who had serious drug addiction, but whose book Naked Lunch is a major work within the Beat Generation. Ginsberg was the poet and activist whose poem Howl is also a centerpiece of the movement. Carr was thought of as a very bright student at Columbia, but committed manslaughter when David Kammerer would pursue Carr wherever he went seeking his affection. This fixation on Carr began for Kammerer when Carr was a preteen and Kammerer was a teacher when the two lived in Missouri. Finally, in New York City, where Kammerer followed Carr, Carr rejected one final advance which led to Carr stabbing the older man, killing him. Carr and a friend disposed of his body in the Hudson River.
That's some Dateline NBC true crime stuff.
Oh yeah, it's a wild story. A story that Carr would change a couple of times too. But Jack Kerouac is probably the most popular of the group for the 1957 book On the Road. Kerouac is credited for introducing the name The Beat Generation, but also Huncke probably was the first to really use the term beat for their movement internally. But Kerouac, Ginsberg, and Ken Kesey, best known for the novel One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, were the ones that kind of bridged the gap between the Beat generation and the hippie movement of the late 60s. Kerouac was the first to die of the group, which probably also raised his status among the public, as over the years since his death, several of his unpublished manuscripts would get found and ultimately published. His death was an esophageal hemorrhage caused by cirrhosis, which was the result of decades of alcohol abuse. But his influence would reach to the major pop culture icons, the Beatles, Bob Dylan, Jerry Garcia, and the Doors. But their writings all gained a cult following, particularly among the now coming-of-age silent generation of the time. The movement began on the East Coast, but by the 50s had moved to San Francisco. Burroughs and Carr remained behind, but the others would be at the epicenter of the counterculture explosion that would later be the hippies, but all began with
the Beatniks.
That's right. Now, generally speaking, the Beatniks hung out in coffee shops or bars, listened to jazz, and engaged in beat poetry. It was a very philosophical and kind of self-serious group. The groups of people would do their own published magazines of their own writings, and this would crop up in several cities all over the country. However, what would be common would be a concern over these young adults who were often called lazy or stoners or weren't really super productive in society, which would lead to their literature often getting banned for being subversive and considered anti-establishment and anti-American, which only made them a little bit more appealing to youngsters frustrated with how the world was. Now, the followers of these writers were given the name Beatnik in 1958, and this was coined by Herb Caen. Now, Caen himself was a very well-respected and influential humorist and journalist. He was basically synonymous with the San Francisco Bay Area for about 60 years. Because the Beat generation was very left-wing at a time when America was at a fever pitch of anti-Russian sentiment, the thought was that they were pushing communist ideology. So with the "nik" suffix commonly seen in the Russian language, Caen just combined it with beat to be the Beatniks. Now, eventually, while Beatniks were not well liked by older Americans, for some, the style of the Beatnik became a marketing tool for several stores trying to take advantage of youth interest in the group. Joyce Johnson said that the Beat generation sold books, bongos, black turtlenecks, berets, and dark glasses. It also inspired suburban couples to throw beatnik parties and drink too much and fondle each other's wives. And like with anything else, of course, the style and the image of the beatnik man or woman became fashionable. So there were a lot of posers getting in on it. And while you would probably have quickly been discovered to be a square if you were around the real deal, beatniks weren't very violent people. They simply rejected conformity and normality. However, whenever you have a subculture pop up, what do you often see happen in entertainment, Nurse?
They turn into exploitation movie villains and murderers?
Exactly. In truth, the earliest appearances of beatniks in film came long before the term was ever coined for the group. They made appearances in 1950's DOA, 1953's Roman Holiday, and 1954's White Christmas. But in these films, they were simply younger people who were having a good time in a scene here or a scene there. The same year as this movie, Roger Corman's black comedy A Bucket of Blood showed a lot of beatnik culture and for the most part kind of represented them in kind of a parody light, where the characters were vapidly kind of interested in things that really weren't all that interesting, but didn't really make fun of them. They were just kind of a parody. And that brings us back to this movie, The Beatniks. The original title would have been more appropriate for what this movie really is, but due to the explosion of teensploitation films, the idea of calling the movie The Beatniks became more enticing for the distributors and the producers of the film.
But what it does is turn this movie into something like Reefer Madness. It makes the movie a joke.
Yeah, that's not what makes this movie a joke.
No?
I would say the movie itself makes the movie a joke.
Fair.
Now, we see this in a lot of other subcultures, right? We've previously watched Psych Out, which painted some hippies as bad guys who would slip drugs to people who aren't ready to handle them or be violent when they typically weren't. How many biker movies showed all bikers to be murderous Satanists? How many times have we seen punks or Gen Xers be viewed in films of the 80s and 90s as violent or just simply mean-spirited people when they weren't all like that? I certainly was. I was violent and mean-spirited, but, they weren't all like me. But we are often sold the worst of any new group of people who crop up in a bunch of exploitation films. But, Nurse.
Jeff?
What do you say about getting into the final act of The Beatniks?
I ain't gonna cherry tree you, Jeff. I'm ready to finally put an end to this monkey run of a graveyard.
I couldn't have said it better myself. So that's the end of The Beatniks, and it does make one ask the question,
are these really Beatniks?
No, we already resolved that. But wouldn't it be possible for Eddie to kind of get off easy here? Like, very clearly Moon is the guy doing the most worst shit. Like, Moon shot a guy to death. Like, you could probably say that you were under duress by doing things with Moon.
Well, Eddie was part of that robbery at the beginning.
Yeah, okay, but I feel like you could roll on Moon and no one else would get into any other trouble.
But, Jeff, this is the 50s. Eddie must burn in hell for not being a square Christian conservative weirdo.
I guess.
What?
I don't know.
You don't know about what?
This movie really sucked, didn't it?
Yeah, it was pretty bad.
Yeah, this was covered in a fairly classic Season 4 episode of Mystery Science Theater 3000. MST3K was always good at picking up some of these early exploitation films. They did both this movie and Daddy-O, which also came out around the same time as the Beatniks, but while having a Beatnik lingo title, also had characters with little resemblance to the culture. That said, that's why they were good at picking up these teensploitation movies that often badly misrepresented teens or delinquents or what have you. It's easy to poke fun at this sort of total misunderstanding of the subject matter. At that point, some of the jokes begin to write themselves.
This does seem like some pretty good fodder for Mystery Science Theater 3000.
And it sure was. Give us the inevitable inevitable? Do the review thing, Nurse.
Righto, Daddy-O. Yet another movie about teenagers without a teenager in sight. You gotta love it, right? Well, no, you don't. You really shouldn't love movies like these. There are no teenagers, no beatniks. Then you got a chick saying to another chick, "What are you, his mother?" while looking like a woman who could be old enough to be Eddie's mother. And Eddie isn't a spring chicken himself. This movie gets a pretty soggy, wet 2 poops out of 5 from me. I got to thinking about what would make for a better movie, and I kind of landed on a super gay movie about a romance between Eddie and Moon, and when Eddie wants to get out of the gang to go be a pop star recording artist, Moon gets super jealous and gets violent to keep his man with him. I don't know if that would make the movie that much better, but it would at least make it a little better. This movie kinda sucks.
Oh, it sure does. Yeah, I don't really have anything else to talk about here.
You had a pretty good chuckle over that one scene at the bar where Iris and Eddie were playing the jukebox, and that guy just nonchalantly walked over to unplug the jukebox so he can keep watching TV.
Yeah, but I don't know. I mean, that's just a funny moment in a pretty bad movie. Ooh!
What?
They also nonchalantly call the barkeep the fat barkeep.
Yeah, that seems kind of mean to do to the guy. He's maybe a little overweight, but his whole existence shouldn't just be reduced to him being fat.
Yeah. That is kind of the thing with this movie. Things just kind of nonchalantly happen. The Beatniks nonchalantly rob an old couple. They seemingly rob each week with no consequences. Iris nonchalantly fucks with Harry Bayless by running into his car. Eddie nonchalantly gets discovered by Harry by awkwardly singing in a diner. Eddie nonchalantly falls for Helen. Everything just kind of happens. I mean, it ended up also making this episode just kind of happen.
But Jeff, it just couldn't have happened. Look, you made me look like this for pre-production. You bought that outfit to wear for this episode. See? This episode didn't just fart out of PC.
What are you talking about? I was already wearing this today. I mean, this is how I dress when you're asleep or not around. Also, I didn't make you wear that outfit. You made that choice with this movie.
Okay, we're still playing the idea that I'm not just some figment of your imagination or another facet of your internal personality?
I have no idea what you're talking about.
Wait.
Nope, no idea what you could possibly be referring to. You are a real person and in no way a made-up representation of anything that could possibly be going on in my noggin bits.
But I really think we should...
Have a good night, everyone. See you next week.